Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Sam Markell. He's bringing tools along, so he may put us to work. So I've asked Sam to talk about a couple of things. One is, first off, we weren't able to get Juan Osorno, our NDSU dry bean breeder, to join us. He's actually in China, I believe. So as a very good substitute, we asked Sam to maybe talk a little bit about the breeding program, and of course the emphasis will be on disease management, resistant genes for some of our more troublesome dry bean diseases. But the main focus of Sam's presentation is to talk about soybean cyst nematode. And hopefully you're aware, if you are a dry bean grower, that soybean cyst nematode is a real threat to our beans, both soybeans and dry beans. Sam is originally from Minnesota. He is our state extension plant pathologist. He emphasizes broadleaf crops. And Sam got his PhD at the University of Arkansas, and he's been with the Extension Service since 2007.
Greg wanted me to talk really quickly about dry bean breeding, and this is one of the variety trials. The dry beans, like every other crop, have a whole host of things you have to deal with when you breed. You know, yield and color and size, and maturity, and all those things. But with dry beans, diseases are really quite important. And there's quite a few of them that are bred for, both in the private and the public sector. You have rust and white mold, and there's 4 different types of bacterial blights, and then there's just a myriad of different root rots. And all of that stuff takes place in a huge network. There's a lot of different trials all over the state, both at the REC, but then on growers' farms. But a lot of the intense disease screening actually happens in greenhouses. And so I'm going to give a plug to the new greenhouse that NDSU has. It's about a $35 million facility, and it has really made it a lot easier to screen for different diseases that you guys don't want or maybe even have on your farm. So a lot of the effort that goes into the screening, you can see the evaluations here, but the initial screening of the breeding program takes place in the greenhouses and in the lab. And there's a lot of people that work on that. And as pathologists, we work with private companies, we work with the NDSU, and we work together a lot on some of these different things. But I'm going to switch to SCN because that's really what I want to talk about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of soybean cyst nematode. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this. Some of you have probably heard me talk about it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the biology of it. And then I have some samples. So I'm going to put down the mic, and there's 4 of us that are going to walk around, or if you guys crowd around, get off the trailers, who can see some of these cysts. And we've got a lot of cysts in Cass County, Richland County, and it's moving pretty quick. And so these, what I'm going to show you in these mounts was cysts that I took on soybeans last week from Arthur and Cass County. And there's going to be quite a bit of yield loss in pockets in those areas. Now that is going to be our problem here probably in 5 years. We don't have that problem yet. We will. So it's important to see some of these things. And then after we talk about that, I'm gonna tell you what you can do about it. And this isn't a doomsday scenario. We can manage this. The key is to get on it early. And it's important enough that in your yellow booklets, and you don't have to open them, but in your yellow booklets, there's a soybean cyst management guide. And inside of that management guide are 2 sample bags. And so the Soybean Council is going to reimburse you for sampling for soybean cyst. They've got an address on them. You'll get the data back. Soybean Council is check off, so obviously you guys paid for it already. It's going to be free of cost to you. And so it's really important to use those. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But so soybean cyst is a nematode. Okay, it's a worm. It's not like a lot of the diseases we talk about, like white mold, which is fungal. It's a worm. And to understand it, you need to think a little bit more like a worm. So some of you, that will be really easy, but a lot of you, it's going to be tough. Okay? So imagine when I'm talking about this, imagine basically like an earthworm, but a microscopic earthworm. Okay? When I say soybean cyst spreads, it's not spreading. We spread it. Earthworms don't migrate like birds, right? Microscopic earthworms surely don't do that either. So we're moving this thing. So it was brought into the U.S. in the 1950s. It was brought into North Carolina. And from North Carolina, we moved it pretty much everywhere that's growing soybeans. And we're kind of the last stand in the U.S. We're the last place that it's just starting to get to. It was first found in Richland County in 2003. It was probably brought there 5 to 10 years earlier. But by the time it had built up in the soil, it was 5 to 10 years before it was first identified. The closest it is to you guys now that's actually been confirmed is Barnes County. So it's moving. It's in 12 different North Dakota counties. It's all the way up to Pembina on the Canadian border. The Red River really helped us with this one. I want you to go through the life cycle with me a little bit, because if you will, it'll help you understand how to manage it. So imagine that you're just planting in the spring, and you've got some cysts in the ground, okay? And the cysts are full of eggs, probably about 200 eggs per cyst. Now these cysts will open up, and the eggs will hatch, and they'll release little worms, little juveniles is what we call them, okay? And they're little tiny microscopic worms. And a mass migration of these is like an inch. But what they can do is they will find soybean roots. And when they find soybean roots, the males and the females will both go into the soybean roots. Now the females will stay there for the rest of their life. The males will go in, fertilize as many females as possible, and then get out of Dodge. And they're no longer important. It's the females that will cause us the problems. So the females get into these roots, they start to swell, and they swell, and they swell, and they fill up with eggs to the point where the female starts to die. And when she starts to die, that's what the cyst is. So when we talk about cysts on roots, we're actually looking at the female's body. Now the female is only held on by her mouth. Remember, she went into that root, she grabbed a hold, and then she just kind of grew and grew and grew and exploded through the root. So if you pull a soybean plant, you just pull it up, all those females will fall off into the soil. So they're hard to see. If you want to actually look for it, get the root ball. So I'm going to put this down, and then Greg and Hans and myself and Michael all have some from Arthur. We've each got a little magnifying glass. Some of you may need it, most of you probably won't. But take a look at the cysts. They're very small. They're lemon-shaped. These are a little darker than normal because they're a little bit dried out because I collected them last week. And then we'll come back and talk about that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the cyst a little bit, but before I do that, the host for cyst, and I forgot to mention this, soybeans and dry beans. That's why I'm standing in front of dry beans. Those are the two hosts. There's really no place in the U.S. that has problems with them on dry beans because there's really no place in the U.S. that grows a lot of dry beans that has a lot of cyst. A little bit in Michigan. We're going to face this problem. Okay, so there's a couple problems with the cyst, right? You saw the cyst. How long can a cyst last? Years. It can last years. They don't all hatch at once. They can last years. And that cyst isn't going to move either, right? So it's tough, and it is stable, and anything that moves soil is going to move that cyst. Anything. Throughout the U.S., the biggest thing has been us, our equipment. Soil on anything. Boots, four-wheelers, equipment. I don't know, beautiful NDSU little trailers. Okay, so anything that moves soil moves cyst. In our area, water is really important because there's a lot of flooding, but wind is really important too. Lots of times you'll get dust blowing, especially in the winter. If it's got cyst in it, the cyst will blow too. So lots of the hot spots we see are along tree lines. Okay, so anything that moves soil is going to move cyst. The other thing that's really important with that cyst is that cyst has to get nutrition from somewhere, right? And she's a parasite. She's just like a human tapeworm. It does exactly the same thing to the soybean. It just sucks nutrition right out of it. It doesn't necessarily want to kill it. It wants to keep it alive as long as possible, but it's going to take as much nutrition out as it can. And as a consequence, you often don't see damage to your soybeans until you're taking about a 15 to 30% yield hit. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. You don't see damage. You don't see above ground damage to your soybeans until you're taking a 15 to 30% yield hit. Okay? At that point, then they'll start to be stunted, they'll start to be yellow, but there is no distinct cyst symptom above ground. But if you see beans that start to turn yellow in early August, especially in a little area, maybe close to the field entrance where you might bring in soil, you need to start thinking about cyst. All right, so I mentioned that the Soybean Council is going to pay for reimbursements. You can take a look for cyst yourself. Everybody knows how to use this. If what you want to do, remember, think like a worm now. She's only held on by her mouth. Get the whole root ball and very gently get that soil off. Lots of times a 5-gallon pail with water will really help because it'll loosen the soil. A lot easier to do this in sand than clay. Okay, you can do that. A better way is to soil sample, and you can use a probe. If you have a probe, you can use one. If not, you can still use a shovel. But what you want to do is you want to get maybe 10, 20 samples in an area that's likely to have cyst. So think like the worm. Where would you be if you were a worm? I mean, you're not going to sample here. The cyst that would be right there would win the Darwin Award, right? They'd just die off. You go right at the roots, okay? Right at the roots. Most likely areas in a field entrance, right? Comes in on soil, on equipment. Low spots, because water goes down into the low spots. Tree lines, because of the dust thing. And of course, if you start to see yellow spots and little lenses, and you start to see stunted beans, and there's a little patch that just isn't doing all that well, that's a pretty likely spot to sample. So you've got 2 bags in your kit there, and you've got an instruction sheet. And if you filled out the instruction sheet, put soil in those bags from those hot spots, send it into AgVise, you'll get your results directly. There's no cost to you. And there's a benefit to all of us, because when you put some information about where it is, GPS, township, whatever, then we can start to see where our cyst is in the state. And I'm going to get information, but I'm not going to get farms, I'm not going to get names. I frankly don't want it. I don't want that information, but I want to be able to create at least some sort of map that shows where it's at. Because if people see that we've got it, they're much more likely to deal with this and find it right away. And the reason that's important is because we can manage this. We've got resistance, it's very good. We know how to rotate. We've got that worked out. We had 30 or 40 years of Iowa perfecting cyst management for us. They really took it in the shorts for the first 10 years, but they did figure it out after a while. But one of the things that we do is we do cyst variety trials every year. And these are variety trials that are put out by Ted Helms, and he works with a few other people in pathology. They're common varieties, they're Roundup Ready varieties. We find hot spots with cyst and we evaluate them. So if you're ever wondering what the value of resistance is or how much damage cyst can do in cyst ground, just look at that table. The susceptible checks at all of those locations averages out to be about 23 bushels. The average of the resistance varieties is in about 42 to 44. So when you get hot spots of cyst, it's really nasty, but resistance will take care of it. Resistance will manage it if you find it early enough. If you wait till you have tons of damage and your fields are yellow, you're going to be taking a yield hit for a while, because it takes a while to get those levels down. All right, do you have any questions about dry bean? Okay, yes. So there's 2 hosts, right? Soybeans and dry beans. Anything else is fair game for rotation. You know, wheat, corn, sunflowers, you name it, you can rotate to it. Dry beans is a host. Dry beans is maybe going to be a bit of an issue. Kidneys, and there's not a lot of kidneys growing here, but they're just as susceptible as soybeans. Pintos and navies, they're susceptible, but maybe not as susceptible as a susceptible soybean. And blacks seem to have a little bit of resistance. Now, I don't know that there's any resistance in the breeding program. We're searching, but I'm pretty sure that most companies don't have it, and I don't believe we do either. We've identified accessions, but that's a long ways off. The question was, none of the pulse crops are susceptible. Field peas are not susceptible, and I say that like this, because garden peas are, and field peas and garden peas are kissing cousins. And so in our tests, field peas are not susceptible, but garden peas are. Cross your fingers a little bit, but I'm pretty sure they're not.